إن الحمد لله الصلاة والسلام على من لا نبي بعد بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. My dear brothers and sisters in Islam and humanity, may peace, mercy and blessings of our merciful God be with all of you. The Eid of sacrifice is upon us, the second major Islamic holiday of the year, and Muslims around the world are commemorating the sacrifice of Prophet Ibrahim, Abraham in English, peace be upon him, mentioned both in the Bible and the Noble Quran. Today, inshallah, I would like to share some thoughts with you about the philosophy of Ibrahim, peace be upon him's sacrifice, and what it means for us today. I would also like to address a question that some people have these days. How could a merciful God make such a big demand from Ibrahim, peace be upon him, where Ibrahim alayhi salam, peace be upon him, understands that he has to sacrifice his son in the way of God. We have to start off, however, by talking about one of the most powerful expressions humanity is capable of, that of love and devotion to someone other than ourselves. And the pinnacle for this is when one is willing to invest in his relationship with his beloved or to honor the beloved at a cost to himself. That is when you're making a sacrifice. And we are familiar with this. We as parents will often sacrifice for the upbringing of our children. Later in life, we as children will sacrifice for our parents also, perhaps when they're elderly and need our care. If I were to ask you what the ultimate sacrifice would be, perhaps you would consider that one of the most precious gifts that we have is that of human life. So the ultimate sacrifice, perhaps you would think, would be the soldier or the policeman or woman laying down their lives in the line of duty. Not for a person close to them, one might note, but for a philosophy or a concept or their countries. As a parent, however, I would submit that there is one sacrifice possible even higher than that of one's own life, and that is of the life of one's child. So consider the father or the mother who willingly send their children off into these lines of duty for their country, for their people, for a higher purpose. Societies and countries around the world treat them as heroes, honor them and commemorate them. Once we understand this, then it's easy to understand the philosophy behind the sacrifice that Prophet Ibrahim, peace be upon him, was willing to make, because it's the same. The semantics and the mechanics could vary, because of course now we are talking about a world of 4,000 years ago. Now let's return to the question that I mentioned at the start. It has two parts. One is to look at God's mercy. But the part that I would like to start off with is to investigate whether it was too big of an ask. Now, the Quran mentions a basic principle in its second chapter where it says, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها. God does not burden anybody beyond their capacity to lift. Ibrahim, peace be upon him, was no ordinary man. The Quran mentions how he, in chapter 6, verse 75, how he was a thinking, intellectual person. In the story of how, when contemplating God, he looks at the stars and he says, regardless of the society that he was in, the upbringing that he might have had, he says, "You cannot be my God." But then it moves beyond this. God takes him behind the curtain, lets him view behind the veil at how God's mercy works. He is made a prophet. He is the subject and object of many miracles, such as when King Nimrod or Namrud has him thrown in the fire for disobeying him, but the fire doesn't hurt him. Such as when at one point later, when he has to leave his family for a while in the middle of the desert, he comes back to see how miraculously they have been provided for and secured. Ibrahim, peace be upon him, was also witness to the miracle of life after death in a story also mentioned in the Quran about those birds coming back to life. So Ibrahim, peace be upon him, was no ordinary man. Through a long period of time, God had nurtured and developed Ibrahim, peace be upon him, spiritually. Only then was he put through this test. His son, Prophet Ismail, peace be upon him, was also no ordinary man. In the most delicate of moments through this, it is Ismail, peace be upon him, who steadies his father's hands, both willing to sacrifice for a higher purpose, for their relationship with their God, putting their faith in his judgment. It is interesting to note here that Ibrahim, peace be upon him, while being a spiritual giant, was not a military general. So as the Quran also mentions, Ibrahim was Halim, tender-hearted. When he actually sits down for the sacrifice, he blindfolds himself. And that is when God replaces Ismail, peace be upon him, with a lamb, accepting, making Ibrahim, peace be upon him, pass his test with flying colors and accepting his sacrifice. The reward for Prophet Ibrahim, peace be upon him, is also a reward that only the Almighty can give. In chapter 4, verse 125, the Quran says, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم واتخذ الله إبراهيم خليلا. And God has taken Ibrahim as a close friend. What higher honor could there be for a believing man? In his progeny, God raises such highly regarded prophets as Prophet Moses and Prophet Jesus, peace be upon them. And from the line of Prophet Ismail, the other main subject in this story, God blesses the world with the final messenger, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, centuries later in Arabia. So this is the reward of Ibrahim, peace be upon him. Let's talk about the other part of our original question now, God's mercy. Well, if you really think about it, some of it we have already addressed. In the spiritual development of Ibrahim, peace be upon him, God's mercy shows itself only after Ibrahim, peace be upon him, has the spiritual capacity is he subjected to this test. The other thing is very important to understand. In the world of 40 centuries ago, many societies and cultures had normalized human blood sacrifices, in their view, a way to get closer to God. Through this one event, through the test of Ibrahim, peace be upon him, God shuts the door on that once and for all. Human blood sacrifices will not be tolerated in God's name this way. Let's now talk a little bit about what it means for us today. The opportunity is to follow in the footsteps of Ibrahim, peace be upon him, without having to go through the test of sacrificing something as high as what Ibrahim, peace be upon him, set out to do. You sacrifice just an animal like a lamb or a goat, but the expectation from God is for a reward much, much higher. You are following in the footsteps of his Khalil, his close friend, after all. This is not a normal act of charity. Charity, of course, itself is highly encouraged in Islam and has many different forms and shapes. This is different. It is a specific act of worship, a ritual even, that God has commanded us to follow, which allows us, as I said before, to follow in the footsteps of Ibrahim, peace be upon him. It should be viewed as an investment in our relationship with God, following on the guidelines of God. These rituals, like the ones that I mentioned before for our soldiers and our policemen and women, this ritual, once it is accompanied by the right intention with the right spiritual context, then it has the ability to invoke in ourselves the necessary emotional response. And God talks about this. It is mentioned in Surah Hajj, verse 37, that it is not the flesh and blood that reaches God. Of course, these are my words now, those are for our own consumption, basically. We eat them ourselves, we share them around. But what reaches God is your piety, as the Quran notes. So that talks about the intention or the purpose of this ritual. When done right, when done with the right spiritual context, it is something which helps develop piety in a believer and helps him invest in his or her relationship with God. That is pretty much what I wanted to talk about here. I hope and pray that my viewers find this useful. I thank you for your time and for your patience for viewing this. And with that, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa akhiru da'wana and alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.